After Pentecost, the apostles set Jerusalem on its ear. They preached that Jesus was the Messiah, and they underscored their preaching and teaching with many miracles and signs. People could not deny that God was doing something through His church, and in particular through the apostles. The Pharisees had given up, the Sadducees had taken up the cause, and they were wrought up because they saw that these men were gaining a popular following. They were filled with jealousy and they sought to silence the apostles. And so they called them in and they threatened them and they intimidated them. And you remember, they put them in jail and God released them supernaturally and they had to go hunt them up and they drug them back in before the council. And then they threatened them and said, "Don't preach the gospel anymore." And the apostles said, "We have to obey God rather than men. We will preach the gospel." The enemies were so infuriated that they determined that they would kill the apostles. Gamaliel, who was a famous teacher, in fact, one who taught Paul, we are told, Gamaliel sought to settle them down and to bring sanity to the moment. And he used this logic. He said, "We've seen revolutionaries come and go before." And he mentions two particular men, Theudas and Judas. And his argument is simply this: when they died, the movement died. And so Jesus is now dead. Let's leave it alone and let's see if the movement dies. If it does not, then it must be of God. If it does die, then it's gone and we can stop trying to harass the apostles. The point is this: he understood that to take a leader out was to bring about the destruction and the defeat of the group he had founded. And that is what Satan does. Satan believes in Gamaliel's strategy, and he seeks to take out leaders to bring about the opposition that he has to the church and to the cause of Christ. So what I want to do is talk about some of the ways in which Satan can be expected to focus on leaders in his opposition to the church. We see in Scripture that one of his tactics is delay and hindrance. Do you remember in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul is telling the Thessalonians that he's been trying to get there, and he actually wants to be among them, but he says Satan hindered him. Now, we don't know what that hindrance looked like, but one way or another, Paul realized that his plans and his attempts to be there with the Thessalonians were being thwarted and resisted, something like the angel being resisted in coming to Daniel in Daniel chapter 10. Satan also hinders the proclamation of the gospel. In Acts chapter 13, Paul is witnessing to a man called Sergius Paulus, a man of influence and power. And there was another man there, a false prophet named Bar-Jesus or Elymas. And Elymas continues to persist, to interrupt, to create distraction. And finally, you remember, Paul pronounces the curse on him, and he calls him a son of the devil. In other words, the devil was at work through that man to hinder the proclamation of the gospel. We know that Satan blinds the minds of unbelievers so that they won't see and won't understand the gospel. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 4, we are told that. He also attacks leaders through ungodly counsel. One of the ways that a leader can go wrong is to listen to the wrong advice. The one I'm thinking about primarily is the counsel that Peter offers Jesus. When Jesus talks about going to the cross, Peter has a better plan. That wasn't what Peter had in mind for Jesus or for Messiah. And so he takes Jesus aside, and you remember, he says to him, in effect, "No way are you going to the cross." And Jesus' response to him is informative. "Get thee behind me, Satan." It's kind of a chilling thought to realize that it's possible for a Christian to speak to another and actually be speaking the words that Satan would desire. Sometimes he hinders through godly people. And then he hinders through physical affliction. We see that with Job. Job is afflicted greatly, and for a while it looks as though that is going to produce a bad effect in Job. He hinders by physical affliction, and that is what we see with Paul. He is afflicted by a messenger of Satan with some thorn in the flesh, that we don't know exactly what that was. What we do know, it was physical. And we know that when Satan attacks our physical bodies, our ministry and even our devotion to the Lord can be negatively impacted. And then he works through hypocrisy. Now, that I think is fairly evident. We see that, for instance, in 1 Timothy chapter 4. He talks about the hypocrisy of liars that are the doctrines of demons. So Satan is working in some way through his demons to produce this hypocrisy. And remember that hypocrisy had to do with forbidding marriage and forbidding to eat certain foods. In other words, forbidding things that God had said were okay, but making them wrong. And I think the end result was that these people wanted to look more spiritual than they were by greater levels of self-denial. And so Paul calls that hypocrisy. Jesus called it hypocrisy too. If you remember in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus says of the Pharisees, do what they teach, don't do what they do. He saw a credibility gap between teaching and practice, and that was hypocrisy. What they said was not what they did. They were hypocrites. And that's also one of the things that I think we see when we come to the qualifications for elders. Not only do you see an insistence on doctrinal accuracy and knowledge of the Word, you see the requirement that they have character and conduct that is consistent. In other words, there's not a credibility gap, there's not hypocrisy, which makes one vulnerable to attack or to accusation. And it's interesting then that Paul, when he instructs Timothy and encourages him, he says to him, you ought to take heed, you ought to give attention to your own doctrine and truth intake, but you also ought to take heed to your life and your conduct. So Paul is saying to him, don't be a hypocrite. Put doctrine and practice together in your life. And I think leaders are vulnerable at this point. Leaders are expected to look and act and talk more spiritual than other people. And the danger is that we begin to be play actors, that we perform as though we were something that we're not. And the greater that gap becomes between what we really are and what we say, I think we're opening a gap for Satan to come in and to take advantage of us. So let us be careful in that area. Then there's the area of the abuse of authority. Satan certainly was an abuser of his authority, but he seeks to produce that in others as well, and we see that over and over. For example, in Deuteronomy 17, when the instructions are given regarding Israel's king, one of the things it says is that the king is to read the law once a year, at least once a year. He is to read through the law, and it says that's in order that his heart might not be elevated above the people. In other words, that the king becomes one who sees himself as superior to others and therefore becomes arrogant and prideful. I think it's also related to the instruction that he not gather up horses and chariots and military might, things in which he might take pride. No wonder David wanted to number the Israelite army. I think that was a way in which he could bolster his pride and think about the power that he had. Think about Nebuchadnezzar, who looks out over his kingdom and says to himself, in effect, sings the song to himself, how great you are. And God had him humbled greatly to bring him back to reality. I think it's very, very dangerous, especially for those in leadership who seem to have success. I think Satan often works in their lives to create pride and arrogance and independence and an authoritarian leadership style, and Satan loves it because that is his style. We see that in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, where Paul says that the Corinthians seem to like to get pushed around and slapped around even by these leaders who take that authoritarian style in their ministry and in their manner. And I think it tells us that what happens is often when we have that mentality, we begin to see those who are below us as people we use for our pleasure rather than seeing our power as that which God has given us to minister to them. Then there's the matter of immorality. Obviously, as we look about, that is one of Satan's primary tools today, because all he has to do is bring about immorality in the life of a leader, and there is great discredit and shame and great harm to the church. And we must beware, I think, of that. Another area is ambition. Ambition may be concealed as though it were zeal, and people praise that. They praise somebody who wants to advance and do better and be successful. But if it is ambition, then it is self-seeking, and Satan seeks to do that. Satan loves to get a solo mindset, a Lone Ranger mentality. So we have Elijah who says, I alone am left, when there are thousands of believers still there and at least 100 prophets. Moses, who thinks that he's kind of burdened with too much that's on his plate, and God gives us 70 elders to help him out. The disciples thinking consistently of what Jesus' program means for them. Can I sit on the right or the left? Who is the greatest among us? And then Diotrephes, of course, in 3 John, who begins to dominate people in the church. That is a serious problem. And finally, there's the matter of people-pleasing. I think you see that with Peter in Galatians chapter 2. It's the desire to be thought well of and commended by others. So Peter, who had the great revelation in Acts chapter 10 and 11, that God had saved Gentiles like Jews into one body without distinction, and how Peter had embraced that when he went to the house of Cornelius. And yet when he is with the Gentiles and Jewish celebrities arrive, he leaves, as it were, the Gentile table and sits with the Jewish celebrities, and he is denying, in effect, the reality and the central truth of the gospel of equality in the Lord Jesus Christ. And Paul rightly rebukes him. And remember, his hypocrisy in that regard, in seeking to please others, actually affected Barnabas and probably others as well. Let me say one more thing about this whole area of attack on leaders. I think that one of the great strengths of plurality is the ability of a group of men who work together, who love one another, who trust one another, and who really care. There is the ability and the freedom for us to minister to one another and point out areas of weakness, areas of danger, so that these kinds of attacks by Satan can be caught early on, I think, and corrected before they go into something that they ought not to be. There is the word admonition in the Bible, and it's a word that is very infrequently applied, I think, in churches. We reluctantly discipline people when they fail, but we're even more reluctant to admonish people when we see them on the wrong path. That, I believe, is the job of elders, not only with the congregation, it is the job of elders with themselves to admonish and warn of those dangers that exist for elders.